So, as I said, I'm a writer, a journalist. I'm based in Orkney, and I'm the author most recently of Islands of Abandonment, a book I talk about as being about the ecology and the psychology of abandoned places. Um, what I did for this book was that I went traveling to various sites around the world to look at the natural regeneration of abandoned sites, derelict sites, all kinds of sites. They might be post-war, they might be post-industrial, they might have suffered terrible economic decline. Perhaps there had been some kind of environmental disaster, or indeed a natural disaster. This image here is of the so-called Green Line in Cyprus, a region that splits the island in two, North and the Republic of Cyprus. And within this zone, there is an area of abandoned farmland. There's also various different kinds of habitats that have become surprisingly biodiverse in this strange period of stalemate since this line was created by the UN. So to give you a sense of the various places I went to, Detroit to talk about the psychology of abandonment, and then to places like Chernobyl, the Salton Sea in California, and Montserrat, a Caribbean island where there was a huge volcanic eruption in the late 90s, early noughties. But today I'm going to talk to you about the plants that grow in these places particularly. So we talk about ruderal plants, the plants that grow out of the rubble. There's incredible biodiversity and sort of strange assemblages of plants that grow up in these places, often unseen or unremarked upon, almost always unsurveyed, but not always. And so we have some really interesting findings. And we do find that there is a remarkable speed by which this natural regeneration can take place, even when it's unmediated or unmanaged by humans. And we're also going to look at some of the plants that can survive in really unpromising environments. They might be polluted, perhaps with PCBs, these forever chemicals, or sometimes things like heavy metals, various plants adapting and living and trying to sort of spin something positive out of this very unpromising situation. And when we get to the end, we're going to talk a little bit about how we need to think about these places, or how we can think about them. What is their value in these incredibly valueless sites? Can they become important again? But let's start close to home. Some of you might be very familiar with the Bings. The Lothian Bings particularly are close to here. You can easily go there on a day trip, and I do recommend that you do. We have these amazing landforms on the outskirts of Edinburgh, these strange red Uluru-like growths that they grow up. We have this amazing one called the Five Sisters, if you've ever seen it, which looks like a fan or a scallop shell. It's very beautiful. And then we have more sort of messy ones, these strange landforms, kind of sculptural. So they date from the 19th century primarily. This huge industry grew up, which was essentially chopping up little bits of stone, firing them super hot to create oil as a vapor, condensing it, turning it into various oil products, and then leaving this shale, these very tiny pieces of gravel that we call blaze, in huge piles all around the countryside. If you, like me, went to a high school in the 90s and early noughties, you probably came across, and the 80s as well, I think you probably came across blaze sports pitches, and you will have the memory of them getting stuck in your skin. They are not very comfortable, but the slag heaps that they created have become really interesting from a biodiversity or a botanical point of view, what's grown up there. And so this was kind of my opening gambit in the book. So I talk about how over time, really a surprisingly short period of time, really 4 decades, we started to see the regrowth. As you can see in these images here, they become sort of marbled with green, all sorts of strange species grew up, ones that are sort of unusual bedfellows with each other. There might be some subarctic plants, there might be escaped garden plants, all of them coming in some sort of randomizing process, beginning to set down roots, secure them a little bit like sand dunes, and then grow up in creating these strange feral ecosystems. they're initially sterile, completely sterile, because they were superheated bits of rock. They've got really no nutrients at all. They started from zero. And so it's an example, a little like volcanic island bubbling up from the sea, or even a strip of tarmac. This is primary succession of a really pure kind. And yet, over time, the different species amass, they come together to create a community. Barbara Harvey, who I think has been a member here, did a number of really interesting surveys in the 2000s. She found that there are more than 350 plant species on the Bings in the Central Belt. There's 19 Bings. And this is more than has been recorded on Ben Nevis. And bear in mind that this has grown up in a very short period of time, comparatively. It's very important for bryophytes, and they serve as a kind of refuge in an area that's otherwise very farmed or settled. We find this a lot with abandoned places. They are often these sort of islands of uncontrolled land. And they're surrounded by regions that are very, very tightly controlled. They've been built on, they're gardened, they're farmed. Whereas these sites can become very dense with life because nobody's stopping it happening. Nobody's weeding them. Nobody is planting anything else to compete with them. Here are some of the species that you can find there. As I say, it's an easy trip from here, and you can walk around and see this for yourself. This Young's helleborine, it's a subspecies that's only found in 10 sites in the UK. 3 of them are found on the Bings. The snow mosses particularly are fabulous. You can sort of climb your way through them. It's a very physical way of interacting with the environment because it's like loose gravel and you have to sort of pull yourself up. And it's this sort of disturbance and the strangeness of the environment that is sort of comes together to create something very unusual and attractive in its own way. Initially, I became interested in this area from an entirely aesthetic point of view. I wrote an essay about beautiful post-industrial places, starting in the Slate Islands, which are just off the coast of Argyll. And if you ever go there, there's some very small islands and they have these very deep, deep quarries that are flooded with seawater. And the impurities of the rock come into the water and they have turned into sort of Pantone palettes. You have these turquoise and cyan and green, and some of them are normal seawater color. And you can swim in them if you like. It's a little bit stale, but it is kind of an interesting experience and an interesting aesthetic. And the same here with the Bings. This was my initial interest. And the more I read about the Bings, the more I realized that not only did they have an interesting beauty, but they had a very interesting biological story as well. Another interesting Scottish site before we move on is the Ardeer Peninsula. So this is down in Ayrshire. Former dynamite works. It was where they made sort of sticks of TNT and tested them. So they have all these little huts set within the dunes, and they built up the sand around these huts so that in case there were accidents, of which there were rather many, unfortunately, they would only blow up one hut, and then the dunes would act as blast walls. And what's happened, it then turned into a chemical site, and now it is almost entirely derelict. There's a small sand quarry, and there's a small, I think, another chemical works, but a very tiny one. And the rest of it is this sort of vast, uncontained space. You get a lot of dog walkers, you get a lot of teenagers setting fires, you get people trying to break into the old buildings and take photos like me. But it's also interesting to botanists. So you get a lot of botanists there as well, and people who are interested in invertebrate life. It says here the unattractiveness, and I put this in scare quotes, is part of what's made it so valuable ecologically. It's been left for a long period of time. And now it's home to many flowering plants of concern, and it's the largest area of acid grassland in the UK. Here are some of the species you might come across. If you are interested in doing surveys, I think it's been very well surveyed for invertebrate life, has incredible amounts of very rare, especially bees. But I think there's more could be found out about its plant life. So I would recommend that as a project if anyone has time. More generally, I became interested in these sort of young, bright things of the plant world, the things that they're real fast opportunists, the ruderal plants that spring up in these unlikely places. So there's lots of interesting studies, I think, dating back from post-World War II. There was a lot of brownfield type derelict sites at that time, especially in London, especially in Berlin. And so scientists in those two cities did a lot of studies about how these plant assemblages come to grow together. So as we see here, Salisbury says, the rapid clothing of the blackened scars of war by the green mantle of vegetation, rather lovely, beautiful, poetic science papers by him. And this is when the willow herb, which we now know to be absolutely everywhere, this is when it came to the fore. Before this, it was really rather scarce, especially in London. And then this was the first time there had been bare ground in this very built-up urban area, and it went wild, and now it's everywhere. The Berliner Ingo Kavarek, I'm sorry if I'm butchering the pronunciation for any Germans in the room, he talked a little bit about, he built this new sort of categories of nature, which I found to be interesting. He talked about the nature of the first kind, which was like a, sorry, forgive me. Nature of the first kind is like a pristine environment. Nature of the second kind would be something like a farm. Of the third kind would be something like a landscaped urban environment, a garden. And then nature of the fourth kind, which he flagged up as being particularly interesting, were these new kinds of wildernesses, these kind of feral wildernesses that were completely uncontrolled, self-willed. You couldn't predict them. They behaved in all sorts of unexpected ways, and they sort of just appeared. And they've got all these, these special plants that many of us sort of hate. We pass, well, perhaps not in this room particularly, but gardeners often have very negative feelings towards these kind of opportunistic plants because they're the cheeky chappies of the botanical world. They're sort of sending stuff out all the time. We've got the poppy heads full of seeds and all of these different types of weeds, as many people call them, that can germinate after hundreds of years dormant in the soil. Salisbury, the same Salisbury, found that he could germinate 300 different species just from the seeds that had caught in the bottom of his trousers as he was doing his surveys. And rather grossly, you can find tomatoes, which I would not really have thought of as a weed, growing all up the sides of, again, train tracks. This dates from the time when the toilets just opened directly onto the tracks. And so we have all these all these traces of toilets going up and down the country. And you find that also in the bings, actually. They have these tiny train tracks going up, and the guys would eat the sandwiches and throw their crusts. And so you have tomatoes growing up in the bings as well, a sort of trace of the history that carries on into the botanical present. Here we are looking at places. There are many modern day equivalents, unfortunately, of these Berlin and London bomb sites. So they too show the same surprisingly rapid regrowth. So we have some surveys that have been done of this green line, particularly actually of the wildlife, but some small amounts of the regrowth, which you can see here is quite extensive, especially in this urban area. The demilitarized zone there is very, very large in some places, kilometers wide, and in other places as narrow as a single street. But you can see, especially in somewhere like Cyprus, and it's quite nice climate, the regrowth has been very fast, and a lot of plants that were perhaps inside people's houses have come to spill out of the front windows and really take over and start to have a new strange life. Somewhere like a war zone can produce very unpleasant after effects into the future. Here is a site in France. This is where, after the end of World War I, they took all the chemical weapons that they'd gathered up in France. They piled them up in the woods and they set fire to them. What happened was that they did burn, and then they created this terrible mulch. It's really a kind of tar. You can see it here, this grey sand-like material in the forefront. This is, I have it down here, 17% arsenic, 13% zinc, and 2.6% lead. The reason there is a sort of cabin is because for a long time, foresters were using this lovely clearing in the woods as a place that they would have their sandwiches. It had been lost from a sort of cultural memory, and then they would sit out, get the sun on their face. It is quite a nice little cabin, actually, if you don't know that you're in an entirely toxic environment. Of course, not very many plants like to grow in such a soil. So we see here, you know, there are some. Not all of them are growing in that site in Verdun, but here are some metal-loving species. So this is a special class of plants or species that can survive, indeed thrive, in heavy metal-tainted environments. Some of them ignore the metal and are able just to survive and get by. They close themselves off to it. And others actively court the metal and they open themselves to it and start transporting the metal from outside of their body into them. These are called hyperaccumulators. Very unusual kind of plants. You do find them all over the world. Actually, I'll nip back here. These plants here, before I move on, they are naturally occurring. They're not necessarily post-industrial plants of any kind. Some of them, like the calamine violet, might have in the past been used as almost like indicators. They call them bioindicators for metals in the soil. So miners might look for them and then start digging. There's a number of them in Zambia that sort of flag up. There's a particular copper-rich marsh where they look for certain flowers and then they start looking for copper. Others are more sort of opportunists. They might live elsewhere. You find thrift actually is often very common in these metal-tainted environments, partly because they're so good at shutting themselves off to salt, they can also do it to the metal as well. But the hyperaccumulators are really fascinating because they are not only growing an environment, but they start changing it as well. They start, as I say, grabbing the metal, turning it into things. We don't always know why they do this. In fact, mainly we don't. But here is a very interesting example. It's like the poster child for hyperaccumulators. Its sap is a quarter nickel, just turned into this sort of beautiful liquid. And now there are lots of people experimenting with how we might use plants like the hyperaccumulators to perhaps filter out heavy metals from toxic environments, or even do something called biomining, which would be maybe you plant certain kind of plants, pick them up, burn them, and then you're left with a metal ash towards the end that might be valuable. At the moment, it doesn't make any financial sense. It costs more to do this than it does to get the metal at the end of it. But it does sort of open this lovely idea that you might end up growing a crop of gold sometime in the future. And I hope that that does work out. I think that would be much more charming. So if you are interested in these plants, especially the ones that are sort of obligates for the metal regions, it can sort of set you up to a strange dilemma. I went down to Wales to talk to people where they were trying to look after their metal-loving plants, particularly the spring sandwort that we saw further back, and some kind of lead mosses that are very rare in the UK. So they are doing surprisingly well at the moment because there are a lot of metal-tainted sites where there have been, for example, here near Swansea, there was a huge smelting complex. People were very worried about how much sort of pollution it had created and how difficult it is to get rid of it. And so they had tried to cover it over as best they can, remove the worst of the soil. But it had a strange knock-on effect, which was that the plants that had earned it this special status were now dying out because it was no longer a metal soil. And so at that time, they were having a sort of great ethical back and forth about what they should do. Should they accept that the site was becoming more normal? Or should they try and retoxify the site? And ultimately, they've decided to scrape it all back up. So now they have all these populations of spring sandworts and lead mosses and so on. They're doing this in a number of places in Wales. I think it's really interesting because it is what's the right thing to do? I don't know. They are naturally occurring. They are appearing more and more around the world. But at the same time, they're in the built environment, or rather the human environment, they're a signifier perhaps of something gone wrong. And I think we don't yet quite know how to value these plants and what we can learn from them. In France, so back in the clearing, slowly things are returning to normal. So these metal tolerant or metal loving plants are beginning to filter back in. It's very difficult for them. Not very many of them can do it. There's three main species, I haven't got there, but a very common type of grass. And then we have a lichen and we have the moss, and it's the moss that's doing kind of the grunt work here. It's the one that is sucking up some of the arsenic, some of the lead, and then slowly over time, it might detoxify the soil. Although the moss, of course, at the moment holds the arsenic in it, so you'd have to pick the moss and allow it to grow back if you want to change the concentration in the soil. You can see here these black areas in D, E, and F. These are the most concentrated metals, and then you can see how the vegetation pattern really reflects that completely. It's almost one-to-one. And one more, so this is also another very difficult thing for plants to cope with, which was I visited the Chernobyl exclusion zone before the current troubles there. My photographs from then are really a sort of postcard of another time. But the reason I bring these up here, of course, plants cope with radioactive contamination very differently as well. Some of them are able to take it in their stride and others are not. Famously, the pine forest in Chernobyl died very quickly after the meltdown. It was called the Red Forest, and this was a whole really rather extensive area next to the nuclear reactor. It all died out, and then as pine needles tend to do, they go red, then it very slowly decay. It was a very sort of a sort of flag of disaster, really. What has happened, and I think that this reflects very well. Look here, you can see when you chop down the pine trees, you can see when the disaster happened and when it didn't. They were growing a lot faster and better, putting down a lot more wood in the years before the disaster. And then afterwards, it is a sort of watershed moment. The pines do not cope well, but other species, particularly birch, do. And so you find that the forest in Chernobyl has expanded greatly. It had been an agricultural region, and a lot of those old fields are being overtaken by different types of birch. You can see the birch here, how hardy they are. They grow within the built environment. They grow all over the place in Chernobyl, and they dominate the forest, which is now 70% of the zone. And just to, I've been talking rather fast, but because one thing that the book, to me, forced me to do was to think about how we value these places. When we think about abandoned sites in towns and cities particularly, we tend to have a very strong negative reaction. And this is based on lots of strong evidence. Abandoned places, derelict sites, have a negative reaction on human psychology in as much as we see spikes of antisocial behavior of all kinds. We see spikes of crime, especially violent crime. We see arson rising, all sorts of negative impacts, which are real and also only in the mind. We have a great deal of fear tied up with the abandoned place. The more time I spent in these derelict sites, the more I started sort of honing in on what it felt to me to be abandoned. What was I looking for? It can be difficult to define. And for me, it felt quite subjective for a long time. And I started to realize there was a sort of time frame I was thinking it was abandonment in the decades. Depending on the climate, it might start to feel abandoned after 10 years or maybe 20 years. In the places where it's very dry or very cold, it might feel like somebody just stepped out the door 100 years later. And so, it, as I say, it's a little bit subjective. But you know when you've stepped into one, it does something very powerful to your psychology. And so I think while I was researching this, I spent a lot of time alone in various places. I went to an island called Swona off the north of Scotland. It's between John O'Groats and the Orkney Islands, where I live now. And I spent 24 hours alone on the island, and I think I lost many small parts of my mind over the course of that 24 hours. I thought it would be very easy. I thought I would be safe. I was dropped off by a boat. See you back here in 24 hours. It was me and a bunch of feral cows that I was particularly interested in, and some empty buildings. And yet I spent that 24 hours sort of lurking around, listening to the sounds. I could hear people in the house that were perhaps birds, or they were figments of my imagination. The reason I'm telling you this is that it has a powerful effect on us, and that's why we often try and get rid of these sites as soon as possible, especially in the urban environment, because of very good reasons. But they, this idea of the untended, the self-willed, the self-controlling landscape, I came to really appreciate. I came to love these strange environments where perhaps it's, I guess the best way to call them is sort of feral. They are making things work for themselves, like those cows, which were living much more like wild animals, like wild deer or wild horses. They had a completely different social structure to the ones that you might come across in a field in Midlothian. Instead, these places were sort of calling me to appreciate that wildness in the plant life as well, and also perhaps in myself. There's a certain freeing aspect of moving through these spaces. Anyway, what I'm coming to say is that I came across this idea while researching the Bings of John Latham, who was a avant-garde artist. He came in to look at the Bings. They were terribly unpopular for a long time. They are essentially slag heaps. They're a sort of souvenir of an industrial past. And for quite a long time, the Bings might spontaneously combust because they still had a little bit of oil in them. They were quite dangerous places to hang out. People might get buried. And so it's had a complete change in attitudes towards the Bings now. If you go to West Lothian and you look at the council logo, you see the Five Sisters. It's become the logo of the area, and that's because people have come to think about them differently. And so this artist, he spent time with the government and hanging out in the area, and they asked him, what would you do to these Bings? Maybe you could reshape them, you can make them kind of cool, it's a great blank canvas for you to do something with. And he went away and he thought and he thought and he thought. And ultimately he said, I think they're just perfect as they are, And he came back, and there's a display in the Tate archives which show he took all of these satellite images of them. He drew maps. He said, doesn't it, if you kind of squint your eyes a bit, look a bit like the Venus? Then maybe it does if you squint your eyes. But what he wanted to do was he wanted to save them. He thought destroying them would be a terrible travesty, that they were, in fact, a kind of unconscious sculpture built by tens of thousands of people over decades. And that maybe they were a little bit like the Uffington White Horse, like a grand monumental work of land art. And so he reconceptualized them, and he helped the government think about them differently. And they came to be valued, and now they are national monuments. Some of them have been knocked down, but some of them remain. Greendyke's Bin and the Five Sisters particularly have now come to be very protected. You can walk over them if you like, but they're never going to get knocked down. And with them survive the creatures and also the plants that have come to make their lives there. And so I thought that was a kind of parallel with maybe how we could think about the habitats there, the ecosystems that have grown up. Barbara Harvey's studies again, she looked at a sort of comparison. She looked at the way that they had managed these sites. There were the Bings that had been left completely to their own devices. There were the Bings that had been managed in what was then quite a conservative way, what was then quite a progressive way. And then there were the Bings that had been sort of made to look pretty. They put nice plants on them, they'd fertilized them, they'd made them look a lot more like hills and sort of rolling landscapes. And in the end, it was these ones, the ones that had been sort of messed around with for aesthetic reasons only, were far worse off in terms of biodiversity than the ones that had been left completely to their own devices. The ones that had been managed in, as I said, then a progressive land management way, thinking about biodiversity and so on, were roughly the same as the ones that had been left completely to their own devices. That in fact, many of the plants that have been growing up there have their own agendas and abilities, and they work to their own, they make the most of what they've got. That's the kind of plants that they are. And I came to think that maybe like Latham, we could come to understand these ruderal plants, we could value them, and the very, very strange kind of landscapes that they build together that might make us uncomfortable are beautiful in their own way, and ask us big questions about what we value in our own environment.